Welcome to Freedom Worldwide. I'm Tom Palmer with Atlas Network, a global network of 563 partner organizations in 103 countries. I'm joined today by three experts from three of these organizations to discuss a really important question. How can people escape from poverty, from unemployment, and from long-term dependency? This is a problem that is faced all across the United States, but many other countries as well. We're going to discuss this today with Christina Sandefur from the Goldwater Institute, Daniel Erspamer from the Pelican Institute, and Eric Cochling from the Georgia Center for Opportunity. Now, I'd like to tee up with one of the issues that I run into all around the world. It's not unique to the United States, the soaring cost of housing, especially in urban areas. As the world is becoming more and more urbanized, it's almost, well, I would dare to say impossible for young people to get into the housing market the way that their parents and grandparents did. I know this is a topic that's engaged you, Christina. What do you think is going on there that's making it look rigged to young people?
Yeah, Tom, you're absolutely right. And, in the United States, owning a home or even just having a space of your own is a significant part of the American dream for many people. And yet, as you've said, it has become very difficult to afford housing in the US. Cities are actually largely to blame, and local regulation for making it almost cost prohibitive to expand the supply of housing in a way that can address the growing demand. There was a recent study done by the National Association of Home Builders, and they say that regulatory costs are accounting for almost a quarter of the cost of a single family home, almost a quarter, and shockingly, over 40% of the cost of a multifamily development. So that's something like an apartment or a condo or even a duplex. Just imagine that. I mean, if the cost of a home is 25%, 25% of that cost is made up by regulation, or 40%, almost half. That could be the difference of somebody being able to rent or own a home or not. Now, as I mentioned, these regulations are really coming in large part from localities, so cities and counties. And what might be shocking to listeners is that they are largely aesthetic regulations. So these are things that are not necessarily geared toward ensuring health and safety, but just matching up with the aesthetic, and I would argue subjective aesthetic preferences of local officials. These are things like cities will have design requirements that you have to have a full basement in a home, or a single car garage, a minimum lot requirement. So you have to have, a big front or backyard, even materials restrictions. So a lot of cities now are actually banning vinyl siding. And vinyl siding is actually one of the more affordable options for building a home. So these are just simply because these are what local officials think housing should be like, and they like the way that certain things look and don't like the way other things look. Well, of course, that is very subjective, but also that imposes significant costs on the ability to build these houses within these restrictions. There's also a number of zoning restrictions that make it really difficult for families to get the most out of their property. So a lot of cities favor what we call single family zoning. So one house that one family lives in versus multifamily zoning, apartments, condos, duplexes, places where people can share costs and lower the cost of living and live together. Also, cities sometimes restrict how homeowners can make the most out of their property. So you may want to add on to your home. You might want to build on top of the home. You might want to put what they call an accessory dwelling unit, or what we call sometimes a granny cottage, a small building in the back of your property, so that other members of the family can have privacy but still share the costs of living on the same property. These are all things that are frequently banned by local governments simply because local governments don't like the way that those things look. And then on top of that, go ahead.
I was just going to say what's remarkable is that so much discussion on this and other issues is always at the national level. But you're pointing out a lot of the problems are at the state, county, and municipal level, and need to be addressed by think tanks and partner organizations working at that level all across federal systems like the United States, Brazil, Canada, Mexico, India, and so on, but also at the local level where we have many think tank partners working at getting rid of these obstacles to improvement locally. But continue your point there, Christina.
Yeah, no, it's so true, Tom. And you know, a lot of, I mean, the Goldwater Institute where I work, and of course our partners here today on this webinar, we focus primarily on state and local levels. And I think a lot of people are unaware that those regulations are often the most onerous when it comes to affecting their daily lives and the costs associated. There are a couple of reforms at Goldwater that we have actually pioneered to try to address these issues. Unfortunately, these types of regulations I'm talking about, I mean, we know that these are restrictions on our property rights, our right to use our property as we see fit. But unfortunately, most courts just aren't willing to address challenges to those restrictions, even if they're stopping people from being able to afford housing, simply because, and for reasons that we don't have time to get into today, but courts have come to treat property rights in the United States as sort of second-class rights. So at Goldwater, we've gone the public policy route, and we've come up with a number of state-level reforms that can curb these local abuses. One of them is called the Permit Freedom Act, and it is a very simple set of rules that just says cities need to follow these basic rules, and it will eliminate needless red tape. So one of them is there has to be clear criteria. If you want to get a permit to build, the city has to tell you ahead of time what you have to do in order to get that permit. And this, it goes a really long way, because a lot of times there's very vague requirements. Oh, your building or your property has to conform to the character of the area. Nobody knows what that means. And then that means city officials can subjectively decide whether they like the way your proposed house looks or not. And then also there has to be an explicit deadline for when the city's going to approve or deny your permit. That sounds so obvious, but actually a significant number of costs, in fact, about 6% of total development costs of a house come from delays in the permitting process, because you file all the paperwork and all the plans with the city to build a home, and then the city turns around and takes its sweet time. In fact, oftentimes municipalities can add on average about 8 months to the time that it takes to complete a home, simply processing, you know, going through bureaucratic red tape and processing plans. And a lot of times, not only is that adding to the cost of building, but sometimes the clock just runs out. Developers don't have that kind of time. Homeowners, people don't have that type of time, and houses don't get built at all. So these are the types of things that we propose, rather than what you see cities trying to do in order to fix the problems that they have caused, rather than scaling back on regulations, which is the number of proposals that we have out there. Cities are attempting to fix the problems that they've caused by piling on more regulations. So they see housing costs rising because of all these things that they're doing. And so what they do is they put into place things like rent control or inclusionary zoning. So regulations that require developers to offer properties either for sale or rent at below market rates. Well, what happens there, if you break down the costs of what it costs to build a home, when you look at the cost of materials, the time, and the regulations that government place, developers don't actually have a huge profit margin there. And so if you're telling them now they have to offer these homes way below market rates, they're simply just not going to build at all. And that means that housing doesn't get built where it's needed most. So to me, this is sort of like the old woman that swallowed the fly, you know, rather than cities scaling back on their regulations, they're just continuing to pile them on. And when the old woman continued to, you know, swallow a spider or a horse or different things to try to get the fly, we know what happened to her. So our proposals are just things like the Permit Freedom Act, things like we have a Property Rights Protection Act, which says that government has to pay property owners when it takes away their property rights in ways that aren't necessary to protect public health and safety. And that one's really helpful because it simply forces government to weigh the costs and benefits of regulating. And if the cost of regulation is too high for the government to pay, then it's too high to pass on to homeowners, and that changes incentives. So these are the types of things that we can do at the state level to stop cities from driving up housing costs.
Well, we know it's difficult, especially for young people, just to get a place and to get a place near where they're working. I'd like to turn to how hard it is to get work and all the obstacles that are put in the way of people getting employment. I mean, if you look at licensure in the 1950s, 5% of Americans were in licensed occupation. Cato Institute study said it's now 22% as of 2021. This is just staggering. But so many others. Daniel, why don't you pick up on that and the work that your institute has also been doing, along with others, to study how hard it is to get a job and how we can make it easier.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom. This is we know in terms of escaping poverty that getting work and meaningful work in particular is not only has physical benefits to it in terms of compensation, but the psychological benefits of a meaningful purpose of doing work has huge impact on helping people escape poverty. You mentioned a couple of stats here in Louisiana. It's been even worse. From 1993 to 2012, we added 59 new regulations, new occupational licensure regulations in Louisiana. 22% of workers are subject to some kind of occupational licensure requirement, which is the seventh highest in the country and the highest in the region. You look at these. We also did a project with the Archbridge Institute and the Knee Center, who does a lot of great work on this, and found a direct correlation, 6.6% between licensure regulations and economic mobility. So if we care about that idea embedded certainly here in the American dream of creating a better life for your kids and grandkids or yourself than maybe your past generations have, this is something that has a direct impact on helping people do that. But the good news is working alongside us is a great group. We've worked closely with the Georgia Center for Opportunity, with Atlas Network, and with the Goldwater Institute to make significant progress on that just in the last few years. Of course, licensure reforms have swept across the country, which is great news. But the headline here, I think, two quick things. One, 2 years ago, working with Goldwater, we became the second state in the country to pass the Goldwater Institute's right to earn a living model policy, which says the government has to prove a health, safety, welfare rationale in order to require an occupational license. And then just this year rather, we finally repealed the testing requirement for our unique in the nation requirement for florists to have a license. Just absolutely absurd. And if you want to have some fun with this, go check out the Pelican Institute's Facebook or website and look at a video my colleagues put together. You'll get to see me in a police officer outfit. So you get a little, don't let that scare you away. But just to really highlight the absurdity of some of these regulations, Tom.
Well, I mean, there's so many, and it's a broad spectrum effort. I know our friends at Institute for Justice who were involved in the florist case. The idea you need a license to put a blue flower and a red flower next to each other and sell them to a customer. Beacon Institute and Tennessee, so many are focusing on this. It was illegal to shampoo hair without a special license, even for your friend in her beauty salon. You couldn't go shampoo hair there. I shampoo my hair every day, believe it or not, and I don't have a license. But you have a license to shampoo somebody's hair in Tennessee. So can you tell us some of the impact this has also on just getting into the labor market in the first place? And then you mentioned labor mobility, having to requalify state by state if you want to move for a better job or because your spouse has gotten a job or whatever reason. Suddenly there's a big obstacle to carrying your profession with you.
No question about it. To start with, getting into the workforce, these onerous licensure requirements have a huge impact, particularly on someone's first job. Most of these requirements are on relatively low income professions, but where are the beginning of entrepreneurism or the beginning of a career. And, if you think about what your first job may have been, if you had to jump through hoops and, you talk about shampooing here in Louisiana, you have to have a full cosmetology license in order to shampoo at the back of a salon. Well, that can cost $5,000 or $10,000. And, either you don't have that or you end up in debt. It's a huge barrier to getting into the workforce. And so we've seen the impacts here in Louisiana with the lowest workforce participation rate in the country of able-bodied individuals who could be in the workforce. Only 58% are working right now. And add to that the youth disconnection rate. This is young people aged 16 to 21 who are neither in school nor in the workforce. And Louisiana has one of the highest in the country. It's astounding and just really depressing to see what these kinds of regulations, and I know we'll talk about the safety nets and how they've played a role in keeping people out of the workforce too. These things come together in a way that's really punishing. And mobility is absolutely right. You know, certainly coming out of the COVID lockdowns here and around the world, we have one of the most mobile workforces in the history of the world. People are moving regularly as telework and other options of remote work become more viable. We're here on a Zoom today. And these regulations, Louisiana just, thanks to partnership with the Goldwater Institute again, passed a universal licensure recognition bill just this year. The governor made it one of his points in the State of the State address. And I think Christina can correct me. Now we're at a couple of dozen states who have passed the recognition. Christina, how many is it now?
Yeah, it's 24. So almost half of the states in the country now have this recognition.
So we want to encourage that, as we want all states to compete with each other to create the best environment for opportunity and work. And this is one way, whether it's, you mentioned it, trailing spouses of the military or other job relocations. The economic development folks tell us it's one of the biggest things that come up when they try to recruit a new company to Louisiana. And this is true in a lot of states. They say, well, you know, what's the education system? Thankfully, we've made progress this year on universal education freedom as well. What's the education system? What's the infrastructure? And, you know, how can my family members get a job? When those three things aren't great, you know, you don't even get to the tax climate and the regulatory climate and all of that stuff.
But I'd like to point out that for those who are tuned in, you can ask questions, go to the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen down there on the chat window, and you can pose a question. We're very proud at Atlas Network to work with such wonderful people with a positive agenda that liberates people, that brings dignity and freedom and justice to people who have been denied it. You can become involved in this as well. A very simple donation. We don't take any taxpayer money, only voluntary donations of $25 to Atlas Network will get you a subscription to our magazine, Freedom's Champion, which is an awesome magazine. And the current issue actually has an article on what Daniel and his colleagues are doing with the Pelican Institute and fighting back for economic liberty through challenging anti-competitive laws in court. So please join the worldwide freedom movement by becoming a subscriber to Freedom's Champion at atlasnetwork.org. I'd like to turn to the really important work that you and your colleagues have been doing, Eric, at the Georgia Center for Opportunity. And when I first started to read your studies, they were eye-opening about benefit cliffs and the impact that those had on people, basically ending up with an over 100% tax rate on income, sort of an equivalent effect on people. And then also the work that you've done to allow marginalized people or people who made a terrible mistake in their youth and ended up in prison, how hard it is for them to get back into the labor market and become productive members of the community again. So why don't you walk us quickly through benefit cliffs and then this work that you're doing for formerly incarcerated persons also.
Yeah, happy to do it. And thank you, Tom. First on the safety net benefits, just to sort of set the stage and define our terms. When we talk about benefit cliffs, it's this notion that when you receive a raise or a promotion on a job that includes a raise, that you're actually going to lose, if you're receiving welfare benefits, more in benefits, you know, lose more in benefits than you receive in the raise. Now that's it's a huge problem in our welfare system in the states. It's $1 trillion business for the federal government annually, just to support the safety net network. And roughly 1/3 of the US population is receiving some form of welfare benefit. And over half of the people that we're talking about in the system receive more than one benefit. And that becomes important relative to benefit cliffs, because as you stack benefits or combine them, the benefit cliff effect becomes much worse overall. And so the most recent study that has come out of HHS looking at the breakdown of, who participates in which programs is basically saying that 2 of the top 3 worst programs for benefit cliffs, and that one is Medicaid, the most subscribed program that we have overall in the US, and then the SNAP program. If you're not familiar with what SNAP means, it's basically the nutritional supplement program, the largest that the US runs. But those are the 2 that basically have the largest cliffs in them, and almost all the people in the system are subscribed to those, right? And when we started taking on this issue years ago, it was generated because we were working in our local community with actually the prisoner reentry population. And this issue came up repeatedly, the welfare system and its impact on that population very specifically. But as we dug into the issue for the state of Georgia, we wanted to understand whether the issue of benefit cliffs were purely anecdotal or if it applied more broadly and was more systemic. So we developed a platform that anybody can go and check out and use at benefitscliffs.org. And we have, as of today, we have 13 states in the model. It is modeled down to the county level for the states, and basically allows you to put in the profile of any family structure that you'd like to see and understand how, as they earn additional income, what happens to them relative to the cliffs. Now, when we talk about cliffs, there are major cliffs where someone might lose thousands of dollars at one time in benefits, but there are also sort of your smaller cliffs where, an extra $1 raise per hour might actually help you overcome the cliff. And that's important because while we primarily work on the policy side, looking at ways to reform the system, and there are ways that the federal government, which is primarily responsible for welfare in the U.S., could reform the system tomorrow to eliminate the cliffs. There are ways within a few of the programs, Medicaid, SNAP, and child care in particular, that states could actually start that process through a waiver process. And so we're talking about federal reform, state reforms that could be taken on to get this going. But there's also a sort of an interesting impact that happens to nonprofit service providers who actually work with this population, trying to help them get out of dependency, and also in the business community. For the organizations that deal directly with the population trying to serve them, they may have the best workforce development program that exists where they are. But they may not know that as soon as the people they're serving hit around $15 to $17 an hour in income, they are likely to face the very worst cliffs that exist. And so what we see happening in the local community is people will turn down raises. They will drop out of good programs like the one I mentioned. They'll do all kinds of things that from the outside don't make a lot of sense, but it's the benefit cliff that's driving the behavior. On the business side, there's a similar effect where people actually refuse to work additional hours. They may actually turn down a raise when they get to this, to a cliff-inducing raise. And oftentimes they don't explain why they're doing the behaviors that we're seeing, but it's largely generated by the cliffs. And so through the modeling and other things that we're doing, we're hoping that this can be used by nonprofits and businesses to be able to help the people that they're working with now overcome some of those intervening cliffs that aren't as dramatic.
To miss a simple person like I could understand this.
Yes.
It means that, let's say I work extra hard, I put in those extra hours at work, and I make the extra effort to attain excellence. I get a raise, my income goes up by $300 a month, but in my real income goes down by $50 because I lose $350 in benefits. That's basically what's happening. Is that right?
That's right. Sometimes that loss can be $5,000 or more annually in lost benefits. And you can imagine the raise that it takes to overcome that. It's just not possible for most people. in
So
a
you
sense.
work harder and you get negative income. You lose money for working harder. That seems
Absolutely.
the word for that, crazy. I think that's crazy and harmful to people who are struggling
That's
to
exactly right.
improve their lives. Well, let me ask you another question about people who have struggled. And this is, I would dare to say, we have a pretty broken criminal justice system in the United States along many, many dimensions. But one of them is you get punished, you do something stupid or something wrong, and you do the time, you do the punishment, but it ends up you're punished for the rest of your life. You can't get a driver's license, even if it was not driving related in some cases. How can you get a job with that? Restrictions on a criminal record mean you can't get a job. What can you do to address that, and what are you doing?
Yeah, so our work on the issue of prisoner reentry, oftentimes referred to as returning citizens, goes back over a decade now. Just trying to understand exactly what was happening in that space. And we did a lot relative to this over the last decade. But to give you a sense of what we're talking about, in the US, there are almost 4 million people that are either on probation or parole across the country. Okay. Add to that an additional 2 million that are in our prisons and jails. All right. And that gives you a sense of the population of people who are impacted by what they call collateral consequences of, incarceration or conviction. In Georgia, that amounts to nearly 500,000 people. We're a state of 10 million. 500,000 of these are mostly prime age people that we would expect to be in the workforce, are saddled with a felony conviction at some level. And there's just a whole host of things that happen to them that make it tough to get back into the workforce, which has been our primary focus. So, Tom, you mentioned a couple of those. One is driver's licensing becomes a really tough issue, especially if there is anything related to drugs in the conviction. A lot of times states want to take away your driver's license for an extended period of time, even after you serve all of your time in prison. In most states, that means you're not getting to work, or it's going to be very difficult to get to work. A major issue there. Questions about felony histories when you apply for jobs. Some people refer to disallowing that as ban the box. We want businesses to be free to ask the questions that they need to ask for their industry, but we have worked on a number of ways that public jobs through government can help lead the way in understanding how to smartly apply a ban the box sort of answer. And really, the idea behind that is that you give someone a chance to apply before asking the question. You get to the interview phase. That's where you ask the question and you give them the opportunity to explain, what the circumstances were behind the conviction, what they've done to change their lives, and why they are a good fit for the job that you have. And so we've worked on that to great effect in Georgia. One other area that stands out is basically employer fears around dealing with the population, and that they're justified. You're worried about not only your current employees and bringing someone in with a felony conviction into that space, but you're also worried about the people that you're working for, your clients. And so a big part of this effort is trying to dispel the myths around the issues with hiring people coming out of prison in this way. And there are things that states and other governments can do to help with this. One is allowing some sort of certification and programming in prisons where when someone comes out, they're certified as work ready. And the state will actually limit liability for businesses who actually take on that reasonable risk and give someone a chance. That actually pushes back against employers' fears of negligent hiring claims and other things that can come out of that. The potential for reputational harm, even if this employee might not do something on the job that hurts, maybe they do something in their private life that gets tagged back to the employer. These are all things that can help with that.
One thing.
Go ahead.
Well, I just the optimism, the attitude you have. These are the problems. We're going to go change them, not just say, well, that's the way the world is. These people are excluded from the labor market. They'll be poor all their lives. something can be done about that. I'd like to bounce the ball around about how to build coalitions of people who honestly want to help people be able to help themselves and reintegrate into the community, escape dependency, escape poverty. So Daniel, Christina, how have you been building coalitions of people who have this positive agenda?
Agree entirely, Tom. And, particularly for folks in the liberty movement, I think we have all too often avoided some of these issues. And it's, it can be politically and rhetorically challenging sometimes to navigate some of these issues. But the truth is, our solutions provide the best pathways and the most practical pathways of opportunity, especially for those at the lower strata of the income scale. And coalitions are absolutely the way to do it. The Georgia Center for Opportunity, the Pelican Institute, and the Texas Public Policy Foundation launched a project together a couple of years ago called the Alliance for Opportunity. And now that alliance includes a number of other state groups and organizations around the country, and it's achieving results. We're seeing actual change in federal law that addresses at least one of the issues in the country's workforce programs that Eric mentioned about, being able to have some innovation and flexibility to address those issues. And states, 3 or 4 states have already, including Louisiana, put together a pathway to change that. We call it One Door. You can find out more about that on ours or Georgia Center for Opportunity's website as well. And as I mentioned earlier, we've worked closely with the Goldwater Institute, both on litigation as well as on these occupational licensure reforms we talked about, as well as a number of other things. Their right to try model moved in Louisiana this year as well. So I think banding together, it allows us to share expertise, share talent, share resources. And, Tom, you make a great point, share optimism. We should be happy warriors for these ideas. And it attracts others. I'll kick it over to Christina, but one other thought, when we started working on the Alliance for Opportunity issues, all of a sudden, not only are we mobilizing sort of the liberty folks, liberty aligned folks in our world, but also we're beginning to see folks from all ends. We had our occupational licensure work had bill authors that were the chair of the Conservative Caucus, the chair of the Black Caucus, and the chair of the committee that was relevant. And we've had Democrats, Republicans, Independents across the board come in. If you can cast a vision that's well-researched and well-communicated and is proven we can show this helps people escape poverty and get into the workforce, everybody can come around that.
Let me pose a question then that possibly, Christina, I think you've dealt with this also. Peggy asks, she says, I love the work you're doing, shining a light and creating pathways for reform. Thank you so much. I live in Los Angeles, a home of so many government-induced programs with negative incentives and consequences. How have you worked to make a difference when there's so much resistance from entrenched government? I mean, that's a big issue, right? Every time you cut back a government program, some person in the government loses some opportunity for having a nicer corner office. Do you see any shifts in government that indicated willingness to change? Are they more hopelessly corrupt or just ignorant of consequences, or are they open to reform? Christina.
Yeah, it's a great question. And look, I won't sugarcoat it. You live in Los Angeles, you know how difficult these things can be. Bureaucratic inertia is real, as you said, Tom. It's difficult to change. But I do nevertheless feel optimistic because, as all 3 of us have been saying today, I mean, we are making major changes and we're seeing major shifts. And I think the way that you do that is all of the things we've been talking about with coalitions, but also, it's as important as it is to have the numbers. It's also really important to have the stories and to explain how these policies are really affecting people's daily lives. And we were talking a little bit earlier about housing. I mentioned the Property Ownership Fairness Act that requires government to pay when it takes away your property rights. We were able to go into Flagstaff, Arizona, where there was a lot of demand for housing. The climate is a little bit better than the 115 degrees that we're seeing today in Phoenix. It's a little bit cooler up in the mountains in Flagstaff. People are struggling to be able to make ends meet to purchase housing up there. And what does the city do? Well, again, it imposes these aesthetic type of regulations, and it says, well, we don't really like the idea of people having multifamily housing. We don't really like the idea of converting like commercial properties into, residential properties because they're not in use there's not a demand for the commercial anymore. All of these regulations that made it impossible to address the growing demand for housing. And so what did we do? We told all the people's stories who were unable to get housing or improve their properties. We filed hundreds of claims against the government for that compensation that would have totaled hundreds of millions of dollars that the city of Flagstaff would have had to pay to these property owners or developers to compensate them for taking away these options. And what happened? We didn't get the payouts. We didn't even really want the payouts. What happened is we changed the city officials' minds. And if you know anything about Flagstaff, Arizona, you know that's very tough to do. It's almost as tough as changing city officials' minds in Los Angeles. But we gave them stories. We told them about people who were suffering, and we sent them a price. We sent them a bill, and we said, this is what it's going to cost to keep regulations like this, and you're keeping people out of housing. And so what they did is they waived those regulations for all of those people. And allowed them to build in a way that made sense for them. And I think that's just critical. And I just want to make one more push again for really looking at things that you can do at your state and local levels. I know it seems impossible when you look at the federal government and you think about how hard it is to even get a hold of your elected representative out there. But the fact of the matter is, as bad as these local regulations can be, it's a lot easier to get local coalitions, grassroots coalitions, to get movement down there and to get people to show up at city council meetings and tell stories and pass reforms like the ones we're talking about that force cities to act in, in certain ways. And again, if you can make it hurt financially for these cities, and make them really see the light and what the consequences of their regulations, even if you can't pull on their heartstrings, if you can pull on their purse strings, then you really can make a difference. So yes, it's tough. It is not an overnight fix, but it can be done. We're seeing it being done.
Well, let me then pose a more general question about what's happened to our society generally. I mean, I remember in Colorado Springs, the leaders of the Bus Jet Society, which is a local partner there was a problem of homeless people camping in the riverbeds. Not a good idea. And creating an encampment there. The city's approach was bring in the police, smash up their stuff, destroy everything they own, including discharge papers, family photos, everything, and toss them into dumpsters. But local community leaders came forward, led by people from the Liberty community, and said, no, let's deal with this correctly. And they went in, talked to people, found them jobs, family members that they could go stay with, got them a bus ticket to stay with a sister or a brother or someone who could give them a couch to stay on, and tried to help them get into jobs rather than just go in and smash up all of their stuff and chuck them out, which was the approach of the local government. I remember years ago, I was walking on a very cold Christmas Eve night, bitterly cold, and I walked past a bar where everyone was partying, and there were two people outside. One was very inebriated and lightly dressed, just lying there. And I said, well, what's happening here? Found someone who could translate for me. And I got a taxi and $20 to send the person home. As they were driving away, a fire department truck and an EMT drove up. I mean, that must have cost the taxpayers $1,000, $800 for that experience. Why would people think of calling 911 first rather than going and saying, how can I help you, buddy? What's the problem here? How do we change that in society, this dependence on the state?
Well, I'll take a first stab at that, Tom. Government is uniquely bad at solving most of society's problems. It doesn't mean government doesn't have a role to play. But one of the things I think you've heard from all of us, at least maybe in the undertones, is really rallying civil society and encouraging local community groups, churches, other organizations to take responsibility for our communities and to engage in these issues. When government steps in, it has a crowding out effect of other people and organizations who could solve these challenges. And the more we can do as we talk about policy, and Georgia Center for Opportunity does this so well, is engage community groups, engage civil society to help solve these problems, Tom, just as you did on Christmas Eve.
We have a question here. Ariquam asks, how do you create a broad alliance of like-minded organizations? So I know all three of you have been so active reaching out and extending those hands of friendship to synagogues and mosques and temples and churches and Rotary clubs and you name it to get them involved. What's the secret to success? If you put it in just 5 words each.
So I'm not sure it's going to equal 5 words, but I'll tell you
Okay.
what. You have to be willing to engage and actually speak to people who don't necessarily see the world as you do. I mean, that's the bottom line. And take what they have to say seriously. And what you find are nuggets of wisdom many times. I mean, obviously, we don't agree with everything that people say. We never do. Even our spouses, right? We don't agree with all the time. But you find nuggets of wisdom and great ideas for reforms because the people that you're talking to are closest to the problem. And you know, we can't fall into the trap that that others fall into and think the biggest solution, the government solution, or turn to the government for every solution is the way to go about it. But I think we tend to do that sometimes too.
Very briefly, Christina, and then Daniel.
Strive to find common ground. There's your 5 words, Tom.
Whoa, okay, thank you.
Rule follower, Christina. Well done. I'll try to boil it down to 1, which is ask. You know, sometimes we just don't ask for people to join us in things and we get in our little hovels and do our thing, but ask and be a reasonable human that listens, as Eric said. And I agree with Christina as well.
Well, you know, I was recently at a discussion in Spain, and one of the issues that came up was what's been missing in the liberty movement. And Peter Gettler of the Cato Institute said, we talk too much about what we're against and not what we're for. And you have presented this positive agenda about people realizing dignity through work, through the market economy, through property rights. This is a beautiful agenda, and I'm so proud to be able to work with people of your caliber and all of your colleagues in achieving this. These are awesome organizations. I hope our viewers will go to websites and look for the Georgia Center for Opportunity, for the Pelican Institute for Public Policy and the Goldwater Institute, and you'll find a wealth of really important, well done, and highly readable studies on these issues and on their positive agenda. I'd like to then mention a positive agenda. We gather together champions from the liberty movement every year in New York, 103 countries around the world, 153 partners in North America. That's going to be November 20 and 21. I'd like to invite you to join me and our partners. There's a discounted early bird registration that's open now for the Liberty Forum and the Freedom Dinner at atlasnetwork.org/events. It's an awesome, inspirational event to meet really incredible people like our 3 panelists here and their many colleagues who are carrying out pro-liberty policies, a positive agenda of empowerment, of liberty, of dignity and justice and peace all around the world. In addition, I'd like to encourage you to subscribing to our magazine, Freedom's Champion. You can get that for a mere $25. We'll bring that. A uniformed agent of the federal government will deliver it directly to your home. And we look forward to seeing you also in New York. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Eric, for a very lively and interesting and uplifting conversation. And thank all of you for tuning in.